And good evening, Viking voyageurs, both here, we happy few, to quote a Renaissance figure, and those who may be watching in their staterooms. We're going to talk about the Renaissance. And I think most of you have had a sample of it already today, perhaps in Pisa. Some of you may be getting a heavier dose in Florence today. What does Renaissance mean? Of course, you've probably heard a rebirth of knowledge for Western civilization. In the lecture today, we're going to talk about how the Renaissance emerged out of the Middle Ages, get into, in depth, what was the humanism that drove the artistic flourish of the Renaissance, and then talk about the legacy of the Renaissance. So what came before? When I was in graduate school, I had a number of friends who were studying full-time, devoted to medieval history, and we used to always tease them that the Dark Ages, why are you studying the Dark Ages? Wasn't it 1,000 years without a bath? It was, however, an important, as they always stressed, a very important era in Western civilization, because after 476 AD, the Roman Empire collapses. And Western civilization is basically preserved by the Christian church in small, isolated monasteries, where they're preserving a lot of the books of the ancients. Eventually, as the economy recovered, they were able to go ahead and expand their commitment to Christianity, to building the glorious cathedrals that we see all across medieval Europe. But the key to understanding the Middle Ages is the structure of society. In medieval society, there were only three classes of people. There were those who pray, the church. There were those who fight. These were the warrior elite, the thugs who had managed to create medieval feudal domains for themselves. Later they become the dukes and the earls of Europe. And then there's everybody else, those who work. 98% of the population. And they have very, very few rights and almost no privileges. They have the privilege to work and give a large portion of what they produce to those who pray and to those who fight. But something different began to emerge in the latter part of the Middle Ages, in part because there was this thing called the Crusades that went on for 300 years, in which European warriors traveled to the Middle East in order to try to take back from Islam control of the early sites of Christianity. These were some of the key cities in Italy that benefited from the Crusades. And with the crusading armies going through Italy to get to the Holy Land, people became interested in getting the products from the Middle East and even from Far Asia. They wanted the silks, they wanted the spices. And two city-states in particular, Venice and Genoa, mastered the trade of the Mediterranean. Other cities also got part of this trade, but also began to develop as textile production centers, which was the case with Florence, where they could go ahead and use wool from Northern Europe and then dye it all sorts of magnificent colors with dyes that came from Asia. And so there, the pattern of the Middle Ages, which was only three groups of people, began to be broken. And in these cities, most of them managed to be independent of the warrior elites. They became city-state republics. Remember COVID? You remember sheltering in place and all that? I don't know what good came out of it, but the Renaissance is one of the things that came out of the worst plague in human history, and that was the Black Death that struck Europe in 1348. It eventually killed half the people on the continent. In a place like Florence, at the height of it, 100 people a day were dying. People began to flee to the suburbs and to farms, desperate to get away from a plague they couldn't understand with no knowledge of germ theory. But out of that plague, because the plague ends up weakening the church. God, why are you doing this to us? It weakens, makes people question the church. And it weakened the feudal lords, the military lords, because so many people died that those who were left were able to have leverage on how they would use their labor. Also, one of the things that comes out of this is this thing called humanism. And at first, it emerges by Europeans rediscovering the texts that were written by the Greeks and the Romans. Particularly Cicero and the Roman poet Virgil are very important in showing this was a literature that was not the Bible. This was a literature that was based on secular life. And so that began to inspire people, as well as a concept that the Greeks had first presented. Protagoras was a sophist in Athens, and he had this phrase that became a mantra in the Renaissance: man is the measure of all things. And it was a statement of relativism, in that it was a recognition that you may see things different than I do, and my perspective could be unique and valuable. Out of that society of just those who work, those who fight, those who pray, now there's more of an emphasis on the individual. And we can see ways in which people began to question things. Two of the earliest writers in the Renaissance in Italy were Boccaccio, who's famous for his novel, the Decameron, which tells the story of people who were sheltering in place during the Black Death. And then, of course, Dante. Dante with his stories of the Divine Comedy, in which he goes on a journey with the Roman poet Virgil is taking him by the hand through hell, purgatory, and eventually into paradise. And to give you a sense of the perspective that Dante's offering here that's so different than the Middle Ages, a church-dominated period, at one point in the Inferno, they're in hell, and Virgil says, hey, look at this. There's a giant gnawing the brains of a dead archbishop. The archbishop is in hell. He even goes on to describe how Pope Nicholas II was in hell. This was very daring stuff. But of course, while you go ahead and have a questioning of religious authority, so much of the art of the Renaissance flows through the church. And we see that very much so in the architecture. Here's the famous Duomo in Florence. And there's a dome, really the first major dome since antiquity that's been built almost since the Roman Pantheon. The facades of the Medici Palace in Florence, but the really outstanding example of Renaissance architecture is St. Peter's in the Vatican, because there again we see the domes that they borrowed from the Romans, that they've rediscovered how to make domes, but also the Corinthian columns, hearkening back to the ancient Greeks. And as people became more interested in getting the silks and spices from Asia, long-distance trade began to revive for the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire. And to facilitate it, they're inventing new ways of doing business. So the double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit. So if you're going on a long-distance business trip, you don't have to carry gold with you, but simply a letter of credit that you can present at a local bank to do your business. And it was a family of financiers that really became, as I say, the godfathers of the Renaissance. And they were the famous Medici family. They start off as wool merchants, but Giovanni de' Medici gradually moves into finance. He's making enough money from his wool trade that he can now loan money to others. And then finally, under Cosimo Medici, the family is among the wealthiest in all of Europe and the most prominent banking family on the continent. And because of their prominence financially and politically in Florence, they become great patrons of the arts. Now, you may remember that the ancient Greeks loved to have nude statues. Not so much the Romans. The Romans wanted to be shown with their clothes on. Medici commissions the artist Donatello to make a statue of David. And he picks the time just after David has killed Goliath. There at his feet is the head of Goliath. But David is depicted nude. And this is in keeping with this, going back to the Greeks' respect and veneration of the human body. Sandro Botticelli is another one of the artists in Florence who were mentored by the Medici. And the Medici believed that it was from the Greeks that our sense of beauty came. So they commissioned this painting, Venus, the great beauty, emerging from the shell, as according to legend. And again, we can see individuals becoming more important. You know, this looks like an ordinary painting of a biblical scene. In this case, the Magi coming to acknowledge the birth of Jesus, the future King of Heaven. But when the artist depicts the people in the painting, like one of the Magi, it's Cosimo Medici's face. And he has his son, Giuliano Medici, and Lorenzo Medici. And Botticelli goes so far as to put himself in the painting. And they're taking a very unique pose of looking straight at the viewer of the painting. So these are all examples of the way individualism is becoming more significant. Cosimo, another big impact he had on Florence was that he cleared out all of the messy, dirty businesses that were on the Ponte Vecchio and brought in instead goldsmiths and jewelers who still dominate the trade on that magnificent bridge. He also funded the completion of the grand cathedral in Florence. The cathedral had been built in the 1300s, but they had a big hole in it where they wanted to have a dome. But nobody knew how to build a dome, but they insisted on having one, believing that sooner or later human ingenuity will come up with a way. And the man who did so was Brunelleschi. And he did that by building a dome within a dome, as you can see in the cutout drawing on the slide there. Plus using a herringbone pattern of the brickwork, which was self-reinforcing.